I'm Jenna Whitmore. I'm 61 years old, and until 3 months ago, I thought I understood what betrayal looked like. I'd buried a husband, raised a son, and built a life from quiet routines and hard-earned trust. But nothing prepares you for the kind of betrayal that wears a smile and calls you mom. Rachel was crying again. Her voice cracked just enough to sound sincere as she told the judge, I was paranoid, forgetful, and no longer fit to manage my own affairs. She even dabbed at her eyes with a tissue she'd clearly staged for effect. She was good. I'll give her that. Every sentence she spoke dripped with faux concern. My mother-in-law has been withdrawing large sums of money. She forgets conversations and accuses me of theft with no proof. It's been heartbreaking to watch her decline. Brian, my son, sat beside her, silent and heavy-eyed. He didn't look at me. He hadn't for most of the hearing. I sat across from them, hands folded, back straight, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear the words. But I didn't flinch. Not when the lawyer described me as mentally compromised. Not even when Rachel said I was becoming a danger to myself. Instead, I waited. The courtroom was sterile. Pale walls, buzzing lights overhead, a handful of neighbors scattered in the gallery, watching what they thought was a sad, inevitable family tragedy unfold. Rachel wrapped up her testimony with a final emotional pitch. Guardianship would be for my protection. A loving act. A necessary one. When the judge turned to me, asking if I had anything to say, I stood. Slowly, calmly. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. I didn't speak. I just walked to the bench, met the judge's eyes, and handed it to her. Inside was every lie Rachel had told. Every forged signature. Every account transfer she thought I hadn't noticed. The judge opened the envelope and began to read. At first, her expression was neutral. Then her eyes narrowed, her lips tightened. Her voice cut through the room like a blade. No one moves. Bailiff closed the doors. Rachel's face froze. Brian looked from her to me, confusion breaking through his carefully rehearsed sorrow. The judge didn't look up. She just kept flipping pages. And in that moment, the power in the room shifted. For the first time in months, I wasn't the one on trial. Rachel was. And I was just getting started. The house was too quiet after Mark died. 40 years of marriage reduced to one empty coffee cup and a silence I couldn't fill. I tried to stay busy, but everything reminded me of him, from the way the back porch creaked to the smell of his old flannel shirt still hanging in the closet. The first month, I moved like someone underwater. I forgot to eat. I'd sit in the kitchen long after the sun went down, just staring out the window, waiting for a car that would never pull into the driveway again. People dropped off casseroles and said all the usual things, but none of it reached me. Brian called every day. Always gentle. Always asking how I was holding up. Rachel's voice would chime in the background, offering to stop by or help around the house. One afternoon, Brian said they thought it might be good if they stayed with me for a while, just until I felt more stable. At first, it felt like a lifeline. Having people in the house made it feel less like a museum. Rachel cooked dinner. Brian mowed the lawn. We watched old shows together in the evening, and I even started to laugh again. I thought maybe this was what healing looked like. But small things started changing. I couldn't find my reading glasses, then my favorite mug disappeared from the cupboard. Rachel said it must have broken, but I didn't remember that happening. Later, a framed photo from our trip to Alaska vanished from the hallway. Rachel told me she was decluttering to make the space feel lighter. The drawer in the kitchen where I kept my address book was suddenly filled with mail Rachel had sorted. My recipe cards were out of order. My calendar had events crossed off or added without my knowledge. She always had an explanation. Always smiling. Always sounding like she was doing me a favor. Brian didn't seem to notice. When I mentioned anything, he'd just squeeze my hand and tell me Rachel was trying to help. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. Because the alternative that something wasn't quite right felt too heavy to face so soon after losing Mark. So I let it go. I told myself I was being sensitive. That grief made me forgetful. That maybe I had misplaced that photo, or agreed to those changes and just didn't remember. But a quiet unease had settled into the corners of the house. And no matter how many lights Rachel replaced, or rooms she reorganized, that feeling never went away. It started with the bills. Rachel noticed a few envelopes on the kitchen counter and offered to help me sort through them. Her voice was light, cheerful, the way someone might speak to a child cleaning up a mess. She said things like, "Let me take care of this. You don't need the stress." At first, it felt like kindness. But soon, the mail stopped landing in my hands at all. She set up online banking for me and said it was easier that way. Then, she started asking for my passwords so she could manage the utilities. I remember hesitating, but she looked hurt, like I didn't trust her. "You told me I could help," she reminded me. "Don't you remember?" Maybe I had said that. Or maybe I hadn't. It was hard to tell sometimes with the way she said things. Phone calls started going unanswered. I'd pick up the receiver only to hear the dial tone. Rachel explained she'd taken a few messages while I was resting. She said people shouldn't bother me so much while I was grieving. I hadn't realized how quiet my days had become until my sister asked why I never called her back. I hadn't known she'd called at all. Rachel smiled and said, "I must have forgotten. Happens to all of us eventually." My calendar was filled with appointments I didn't remember making. She said I'd agreed to meet with a financial advisor she recommended. When I looked confused, she rubbed my arm and said grief does funny things to memory. The house no longer felt like mine. My routines were rewritten. My space adjusted. Even my wardrobe was downsized to what Rachel called more appropriate choices for this phase of life. She moved my things without asking, replaced furniture without warning, and when I couldn't find something, she'd frown and say, "We already talked about this, remember?" There were days I genuinely questioned whether I was slipping. I'd forget where I left my keys, then wonder if I'd ever pick them up. I'd repeat a story and feel embarrassed when Rachel told me I'd already shared it. Brian never saw it. She kept things light around him. Sweetness with just the right amount of concern. She'd pull him aside and tell him how worried she was about me, how I seemed off lately. I started saying less, asking for less. I didn't want to be difficult or sound paranoid. But in the quiet moments, I could feel something inside me dimming. It was like I was slowly being erased. And I was letting it happen. It was a Tuesday morning when I opened the envelope from the bank. I almost threw it away, assuming Rachel had already taken care of it like she always did. But something made me pause, something I couldn't quite name. The numbers didn't make sense. A withdrawal of $12,000, then another for $6,000. My hands started to shake as I flipped through the pages. There were dates I didn't recognize, transfers I never authorized. A total of nearly $38,000 has gone from my savings in less than 2 months. I stood in the kitchen staring at those numbers, the room suddenly feeling colder than it had in weeks. When I confronted Rachel, she blinked like I'd spoken a foreign language. She said we'd talked about this, that the money had gone to house repairs, a new furnace, maybe some plumbing. I asked for receipts. She said I'd seen them already. I told her I hadn't. She smiled softly and said I'd probably forgotten, that I'd been under a lot of stress. Then, her voice dropped lower, and she gently asked if I was okay. There it was again, that soft, sticky concern, that insinuation wrapped in kindness. Maybe I needed to rest. Maybe I was confusing things. Maybe I was starting to worry too much. Brian stood off to the side, quiet, like always. He glanced at me with that tired, uncertain expression he'd been wearing more and more lately, like he didn't know who to believe anymore. I told them both I needed some space and went to my room. I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed with the bank statement in my lap. For the first time in weeks, I stopped asking what was wrong with me. I started asking what was really going on. The fog that had settled over everything since Mark died began to lift. It didn't clear all at once, but enough light came through for me to see that I wasn't just grieving. I was being deceived. Rachel wasn't helping me. She was helping herself, and I had let her in. I had handed her the keys and watched her rearrange my life. I should have seen it sooner. I should have trusted the small voice inside me that had been whispering for weeks. But shame has a way of silencing instinct, and grief makes you doubt your own reflection. That afternoon, I sat at my desk and opened my old filing cabinet. I pulled out every bank record I could find. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just started reading. And for the first time in a long while, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I started with the spare phone I kept in the bottom drawer of my nightstand. It wasn't connected to anything, but it had a working camera and just enough storage to do what I needed. At night, I used it to photograph every bank statement, every suspicious charge, and every form, with a signature that didn't look like mine. I created a cloud account that Rachel didn't know existed and uploaded everything there. I gave the account a generic name, something no one would associate with me. Every document was labeled, time-stamped, and cross-referenced. The next step was sound. I bought a small voice recorder and carried it in the pocket of my cardigan. I pressed record whenever Rachel spoke about money or mentioned how forgetful I'd become. Most of the time, I just nodded and let her talk. I pretended not to notice when she logged into my accounts from her laptop. I acted surprised when she showed me budget plans I'd supposedly approved. I played dumb, and it made her bolder. In the meantime, I reached out to Elise, a former colleague I hadn't spoken to in years. She'd left the firm to become a legal consultant, specializing in elder financial abuse. I sent her a short message asking if we could talk. We met in her office under the pretense of having lunch. I didn't tell Rachel where I was going, just that I needed a walk. Elise didn't ask many questions. She just listened, took notes, and asked me if I was ready to start documenting everything formally. She gave me a checklist: what to look for, what to save, what to record. It felt clinical and methodical, which is exactly what I needed. My fear had to become a process. Back at home, I returned to my role, the confused widow, the grateful mother-in-law. I let Rachel think she had me wrapped tightly in her web, and while she rearranged my home and siphoned off what was left of Mark's savings, I built my case. There were moments I thought she might catch on. She'd stop talking mid-sentence and look at me like she was trying to read my mind. She once asked why I was always so quiet lately. I smiled and told her I was just tired. I started sleeping with my door locked, though I never told anyone that. I kept a second set of keys and moved my important files to a different cabinet. I knew if I made one wrong move, she might try to shut things down. But for now, she believed she was in control. She thought I was slipping, that I was weak, that I couldn't fight back, and that was her mistake. Because I was watching everything. And I wasn't alone anymore. Rachel took the stand like she had rehearsed it for weeks. Her voice trembled just enough to sound sincere. She spoke of love, of concern, of how painful it had been to watch me deteriorate. She described my supposed confusion, the missed payments, the moments of paranoia. Her eyes filled with tears as she talked about how hard it had been to convince Brian that something was wrong. She said they had tried everything before filing for guardianship. Brian sat beside her, looking down at his hands. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Rachel had done all the talking for him, just like she always did. The lawyer followed up with charts, statements, and carefully selected examples that painted me as a woman slipping away from reality. Friends of Rachel's stood up to say I'd become withdrawn, erratic. Even my neighbor claimed I'd once wandered into the yard at night wearing mismatched shoes. The courtroom was quiet, respectful, almost sympathetic. Every word out of Rachel's mouth was soaked in concern. Every sentence is framed as an act of protection. I sat still, hands folded, lips pressed tight. When the judge asked if I had anything to say, I stood slowly. The room turned toward me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply asked permission to submit evidence. I pulled a thick folder from my bag and handed it to the clerk. Inside was everything. Bank records, forged documents, photographs, audio files, a printed transcript of a conversation where Rachel described how guardianship would give her full control of my assets. The judge read in silence. Her expression didn't change at first, but I watched her eyes sharpen. She flipped through the pages with increasing speed. Then she looked up and asked Rachel to return to the stand. Rachel looked confused, maybe even a little nervous. Her smile faltered as she took her seat again. The judge asked about the withdrawals, the forged signatures, the recordings. Rachel tried to stammer through it. Said I was confused. Said the documents weren't real, that someone must have coached me. But her voice cracked, and she couldn't stop glancing at Brian. Then the judge asked me one question. Had I compiled this evidence myself? I said yes. I'd also had help from a certified forensic accountant and a legal advisor who specialized in elder abuse. There was a long silence. Then the judge set the folder down and turned to the room. This petition is not only denied, she said, it is dismissed with prejudice. Rachel opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The judge continued. What I've seen here today is a calculated attempt to manipulate legal protections for personal gain. The courtroom remained silent, except for the shuffle of papers and the steady hum of disbelief. Brian looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. His eyes were wide, his face pale. Rachel reached for his hand. He pulled it away. As I sat back down, I didn't smile. I didn't need to. The truth had done the talking, and the silence that followed was louder than anything I could have said. After the trial, the house felt different. Not just quieter, but steadier, like it had been reset to the way it was before everything started slipping out of place. Brian came by a week later. He stood on my porch for a long time before knocking. When I opened the door, he didn't speak. He just looked at me, eyes full of shame, and said he was sorry. We talked for a long time. There were no easy answers, no perfect apologies, but there was space for truth, and that was enough to begin rebuilding something broken. I didn't expect forgiveness to feel like grief. It came with its own ache, its own silence. But I gave it to him anyway, because I knew Rachel had wrapped him in the same lies she used on me. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. I wanted peace. And for the first time in months, I could see the shape of it. With the help of a few retired colleagues, I started a small workshop at the community center. It was simple at first, just a few flyers and a folding table. But the turnout surprised me. Seniors showed up with shoeboxes of paperwork, with questions, with stories that echoed mine. They weren't helpless. They were scared, isolated, and sometimes just one kind word was enough to crack the wall of silence they'd been living behind. We called the program Second Glance, because sometimes that's all it takes to spot what someone hoped you wouldn't see. By the end of the first month, we had 3 volunteers, 2 pro bono lawyers, and a waiting list. I started sleeping better. I started gardening again. I even joined a book club. And every time I helped someone else protect their independence, a small part of me healed too. What Rachel tried to steal wasn't just money. It was my voice, my confidence, my identity. But she miscalculated. She thought grief had broken me. She didn't realize it had only quieted me long enough to observe, long enough to remember who I was. Now, when I look in the mirror, I don't see a victim. I see a woman who fought back with her mind intact and her dignity stronger than ever. I see someone who refuses to be erased. We live in a world that teaches older women to shrink, to question their memories, to hand over the keys and step aside. But I won't shrink. I won't fade. Because of the storm, she tried to survive with me, and I'm still standing.